Chapter 72 of the Book of Enoch describes something no standard cosmology has ever accounted for: a second luminary, moving on its own path through the same gate system as the sun, described in language almost identical to the sun itself, except for one detail. This second light is never shown to humanity. The text says, the moon stands between it and the earth, not by accident, by design. And when you ask why, the manuscript gives an answer most translations have quietly softened for over a century. If details like this are the reason you keep coming back to ancient texts, instead of taking the standard explanation at face value, hit subscribe now. Every week we go back into the manuscripts and pull out what got smoothed over in translation. And if a theory is already forming in your head, drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. The Astronomical Book, chapters 72 through 82, is the oldest and most technically precise section of Enoch. It is not vision language. It is not symbolic. Uriel walks Enoch through the actual mechanics of the sky. Gates, cycles, the 364-day calendar, the precise timing of sunrise and sunset across the year. It reads like a field manual, not a sermon, which is exactly why one passage stands out as strange rather than symbolic. Chapter 72 describes the sun's path through 6 eastern and 6 western gates in exhaustive, repetitive detail. And then, almost in passing, it mentions a second great light, moving, cyclical, governed by its own gate system, that the text never actually shows completing its journey to the visible sky. Every other body in the astronomical book is described the same way: gate, path, arrival, visibility. The sun rises, crosses, sets. The moon waxes, wanes, returns. But this second light is described with a path and a governing structure, and then the text simply stops following it before it reaches the sky. No arrival is recorded. No visibility is confirmed. In a document this obsessively precise about timing and observation, an unfinished description is not a small thing. Uriel describes gates for bodies he never shows completing their route. Why include a structure for something the text refuses to let us see finish? Here is where it gets specific. The Ge'ez term used for what standard translations render simply as moon in this passage carries a secondary meaning scholars rarely discuss outside of technical commentary. Something closer to the one that stands before, or the one that stands in place of. Not merely a satellite, a positional term, a thing defined by where it is standing, not simply by what it is. If the moon is being described by its position relative to something else, the obvious question is what that something else happens to be standing in front of. The astronomical book gives 12 gates total for the sun's yearly path, 6 on the eastern horizon, 6 on the western. But a careful reading of chapter 72 reveals a 13th reference, a gate mentioned once, associated with the second light, and never assigned a corresponding western counterpart the way every other gate is. Every other gate in the system is paired. This one is not. A door with no matching exit, in a text otherwise obsessed with structural symmetry, is either a scribal gap 15 centuries wide, or it was never meant to be paired with anything on our side of the sky at all. Before we go further, if you're the kind of person who notices when a system that's supposed to be perfectly symmetrical suddenly isn't, subscribe and like this video. It helps this research reach the people actually paying attention to details like this. And tell me in the comments, do you think that unpaired gate is a copying error, or something the text meant to leave open? This is the part almost nobody covers directly, because it requires reading past the smoothed-over English. Chapter 75. In the more literal renderings restored by scholars working directly from the Ge'ez, rather than relying on Charles's 1906 edition, describes certain luminaries as having their governance altered so that their brightness would not add to what is already given to humanity, not destroyed, not hidden by accident, altered, deliberately reduced or redirected with a stated reason, so that it would not add to what humanity already has. That is not a neutral astronomical footnote. That is a text describing a decision and describing a limit placed on what people were meant to receive. The 364-day calendar Enoch describes is precise almost to the point of obsession, and it is built entirely around a single solar cycle. If a second light existed on a comparable orbit and was fully visible, The calendar would need to account for it, the way it accounts for the moon's separate cycle elsewhere in the same book. It doesn't. The astronomical book treats the sky as though only one great light governs the day, even while describing a second one with its own gates, its own path, its own governing structure. A system this thorough does not simply forget to mention something it already described in detail 2 chapters earlier. Return to that earlier phrase, the one that stands before. If the moon is defined in this passage not simply as a light in its own right, but as something positioned between the earth and something else, its function in the text quietly shifts. It is not just a nightlight governing tides and calendars. It is described, in this one passage, almost as an intermediary, a body whose defining feature, at least here, is what it stands in front of rather than what it emits on its own. No other passage in Enoch's cosmology assigns the moon this kind of positional role. It appears exactly once, in the same chapter as the unpaired gate and the unfinished path. None of this is a claim about a literal hidden planet or a physical body orbiting behind the moon. Nothing in modern astronomy supports that, and the text itself never makes so bold a claim outright either. What is worth noting, cautiously, is that Enoch's insistence on precise gates, governed light, and deliberate reduction of visibility describes a universe with more structure and more intentional limitation than the popular image of ancient sky worship usually allows for. Whatever the writer believed he was recording, he wasn't recording vague reverence for the sky. He was recording a system with rules, and this passage says plainly that the rules include withholding. The astronomical book survived largely intact through the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, preserved outside of Rome's reach for over 1,000 years. When the Council of Laodicea removed Enoch from Scripture in 364 CE, the stated objections centered on the Watcher's material and the angelic hierarchy, not on the astronomical chapters specifically. Which means this passage, this unpaired gate, this deliberately altered luminary, was never directly addressed by the men who decided the book was too dangerous to keep. It wasn't refuted. It simply went out with everything else, filed under the same broad ban, never individually examined, never individually explained. R.H. Charles's 1906 translation, still the most widely referenced English edition, renders the altered governance passage in softer, more general language than the Ge'ez supports, glory and diminishment, rather than deliberate limitation. Later translators working more directly from the Ethiopian manuscripts have restored some of that specificity, without ever fully resolving what it was pointing at. If this is the kind of thread you want pulled further, hit subscribe and like the video now. There's more in this series, and it goes deeper into what the astronomical book says about the gates and the calendar. And I want to know, do you think that second light was ever meant to be seen at all, or was withholding at the point from the very beginning? Tell me in the comments. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe an ancient astronomer was simply describing a second luminary as a literary device, a mirror for the sun, never meant to be taken as a real, separate body with its own path and its own gate. Or maybe a text written before the Roman Empire existed is describing something about the sky that its own translators have spent 100 years quietly softening, one word at a time, without ever fully explaining why. The gate is still unpaired. The path is still unfinished. And the moon, in one single chapter of a book the church tried to erase, is still described as the one standing in front of something we were never shown. So I'll leave you with the question the text itself never answers. If something really was withheld from us on purpose, what would change about how we look at the sky tonight? Tell me what you believe in the comments. I read every one.